Okay, let's get going. Hi everyone, I'm Neil Alston, I'm Chair of Compass. This is our second annual Compass lecture. We're absolutely delighted you're here and we're delighted to have this panel. I'll introduce the panelists slightly more fully when they're going to respond to David, but we've got Ed Miliband, Caroline Lucas, Evan Harris and Francesca Klug. It's hard trying to find people who you want to listen to for half an hour. And you're on the platform, we listen to you all the time, Evan, and for at least half an hour. But there's a thing about the hollowing out of British politics and the hollowing out of the public intellectual. And when you look around to find out who are the public intellectuals that you want to listen to, they tend to be of a slightly older generation. And the thing that I love about David is that at the age of 77, I think that's right, isn't it? 76. 76, oh, I didn't look at the actual birthday. 76, he's only 76. That he's still incredibly vital. He's still challenging us and himself and thinking and developing and moving his politics in incredibly, I think, interesting and challenging ways. He's had an illustrious political and academic life as a Labour MP, as an advisor in Europe, as a senior academic. He's published some absolutely fantastic books. Most of you will have looked at or seen The Progressive Dilemma. You'd have looked at the book, The Decline of the Public, or more recently, Britain Since 1918. Fantastic output. The book that stands out to me from David more than any is this one, The Unprincipled Society. I can't remember when it was published, but it really is the kind of analysis, 1988. To me, it's the analysis of the decline of the post-war settlement, about why we got it wrong. And like any good book, it says exactly what it is on the title. It's about that notion that our society, if we want to improve it, if we want to progress it, has to be underpinned by a moral basis. Because if it's just about what works, or socialism being what Labour governments do, then as soon as there is a crisis, an intellectual, economic, social crisis, it falls apart, as it did in the 70s and 80s for us. And you have to underpin what you're doing, what you're believing, your action, by a moral argument, a moral case. It sounds simple, but I think it's incredibly true and incredibly important as we rebuild the left. So this book stands out to me from David's work. And the other thing that stands out to me, and I don't know if you'll remember this, is a debate he did with Anthony Giddens. Do you remember him? About the nature of the third way and social democracy. And Anthony Giddens kept talking about a social democratic society, when we arrive at a social democratic society. And David took him to task and said, you don't understand. You don't arrive at a social democratic society. There is no perfect society. The point is to be on the journey, to try and improve, to strive, to make better. It is the process, it is the means, there is never an end. And I just thought I found that incredibly enlightening about what I thought about our kind of politics and our kind of journey and what we are trying to do. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're all here, the panel's here, to listen to someone who is worth listening to for no more than 30 minutes. David Marquand.
Thank you. A little bit. I'm just going to take a small bit of water with me, just in case. I'll probably spill it or something. I can't help it. Anyway, Neil, bless you. That was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. I am so flattered, so moved by what you had to say. At the end of your remarks, I thought maybe I should actually not speak at all, and I should leave you to explain my ideas, because you're doing it better than I did. I was particularly touched that you mentioned the Unprincipled Society, because that's actually my favourite of the books I've written in the last, actually 30 years, God help me. Anyway, and also, can I say, I'm enormously flattered that you invited me to give this lecture. Enormously flattered. I can't tell you how proud I am, and how proud I am that you have managed to get such an amazingly distinguished panel as well. I hope I live up to your billing. Perhaps I should begin by saying something about this rather peculiar title. Why a realignment? And why a realignment of the mind? Well, what I'm trying to get at is this. I'm not going to talk about the party battle in Parliament or elsewhere. I'm not going to talk about political parties as such. This isn't because I don't think they matter. Of course, they matter enormously. But I think we need to dig deeper than they can. I think we need an unconstrained national conversation across party boundaries about the economic, political, and moral predicament that we face as a people. And I think, too, that all the major traditions of our political culture, conservative, liberal, and socialist or social democratic, should take part. None of them has a monopoly of the truth. All of them have, I think, valuable insights. And I'll come to what I think some of these insights are later on. Now, I think the conversation needs to start with the economic crisis of 2008 to 9, the second most shattering in the long history of capitalism. Only the Great Depression of the 1930s was more so. It might have been expected to trigger departures from the pre-crisis neoliberal orthodoxy. After all, that's what happened, at least in some places, in the 30s. Roosevelt and Hitler both departed very radically from the orthodoxy that had prevailed before the Great Depression. I mention Hitler because it's worth remembering that not all departures are necessarily nice. But nothing of the sort seems to have happened this time. No substantial political leader that I know of has echoed Roosevelt's marvelous call on the American people to drive the money changers from the temple. None. I haven't heard it. Everywhere, the question seems to be, how do we get back to business as usual? Of course, with some improvements and modifications. Keynesians want to get back by way of stimuli, as laid down by the master. Neoliberals want to do so via spending cuts and balanced budgets. The differences between them are real and they're important. But the two groups disagree about the route, not about the destination. Both want to get to the same place. They want to get back to the imaginary sunlit uplands of ever-rising living standards and a tarted-up version of the untamed capitalism which has roared across the world in the last 30 years. But the crisis demonstrated that the assumptions underlying this untamed capitalism are simply wrong. We now have learnt again that markets don't always know better than governments, that private greed does not produce public benefits, that the lords of creation in the hedge funds and investment banks are not wealth creators, they're wealth destroyers, that a rising tide does not invariably float all boats. Wealth has not trickled down from the ultra-rich to the rest of society. The self-regulating market of neoliberal economic theory has been shown to be a phantom, whose pursuit has produced outrageous inequalities and, in the end, a catastrophic fall in employment and output. The turbo-capitalism, as an American political economist whose name I now forget has called it rather nicely, has not been driven by rational economic actors. The rational economic actor is another phantom. It's been driven by stampeding hordes of electronic gamblers. Now, I think no single school of thought or political tradition can offer an adequate explanation of the crisis or an alternative to the neoliberal worldview, which has now collapsed. But I think, too, and I'm a bit shy of saying this in a way, because this is what I used to think about, well, nearly 60 years ago, and I've somehow come back to it. I think that Marx has more to say to this extraordinary world we live in than Keynes or Hayek or any of their followers. Of course, Marx was wrong about a lot of things. The proletariat has not become the gravedigger of the bourgeoisie, and it's not going to. But he was right, I think, about the essential dynamic of capitalism, the restless, voracious, all-consuming search for profit that replaces traditional social ties with the cash nexus and breaks down what Marx and Engels called the Chinese walls, dividing nations and traditions and ways of life from each other. We call it globalization now, as though it was an incredibly new idea. Actually, Marx thought of it 160 years ago. Now, I want to look at the implications of all this for three aspects of our life as a nation. First of all, I want to look at what I call the public realm. The realm of equity, citizenship, professional duty, and civic virtue, if I can use that ancient term, as opposed to the market domain of buying and selling on the one hand, and the private domain of love, family, and friendship on the other. One of the greatest achievements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was to carve out such a public domain from the private and market domains. Examples include the creation of a career civil service recruited on merit, the so-called gas and water socialism that transformed living conditions in London and other great cities in this country. Lloyd George's National Insurance Act, and Aaron Bevan's creation of the National Health Service. These are all examples of the growth of a public domain. But, there was a flaw. There was a flaw because the guardians and architects of the public domain forgot about the inherent veracity of capitalism that Marx had diagnosed. They assumed that their achievement was safe, that the institutions and norms of the public domain were and would remain inviolate. They failed to see that the market domain is inherently expansionist, and that if it's given half a chance, it's likely to invade or annex parts of the public domain. As untamed capitalism roared ahead, that is precisely what happened. Gingerly at first, but then with mounting confidence, first the Thatcher government and then the successor New Labour governments pushed back the frontiers of the public domain in order to expand the market domain. Of course,